And I believe we are live. Yes, we are. Hey, everybody. It's Uncle Grumpy. Welcome to Grumpy Tonight. Tonight, as you can see, we have from the OBNDD, we have Mark Woodward. Hold on. I got too many things going on here. It's Uncle Grumpy. Well, sorry about that. Had my own echo. Well, as you can see, we have Mark Woodward of the OBNDD with us, and of course, Dr. Pasternack. Tonight, we're going to talk about a number of things. We're going to start with Mark. We're going to ask about some portions he's had added, or the OBNDD has had added to 2612. It's SB 2612, but over on the Senate side, or it's HB, and they've added over on the Senate side, as well as what we've all seen all over Facebook, the most recent bust. Then after that, we're going to let Mark go, and Dr. Pasternack and I are going to look a little bit deeper into 2646, as well as some possible beginner language for what might be the next step. So with that being said, Mark, how you doing tonight?
Appreciate you having me back on the show.
Lawrence, how about you? You doing okay up there?
I am. I basically have spent pretty much all my waking life sitting in front of Zoom meetings for the past few weeks. It's sort of the new world, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I've noticed you are considerably more comfortable on camera than you were a year ago. Of course, I think we all are at this point. Mark, you've always been a camera hog. You've been the spokesman for the OBNDD. So, I mean, is that not why you take the job?
They always track me down. It doesn't matter where I hide. They find me. So usually I'm up there at the Capitol. They find me in the hallways up there with you visiting. So.
All right. So I'm going to share this to a few places. While I'm doing that, Lawrence, I would like you to ask Mark a couple questions about the sections that the OBNDD has requested be put into HB 2646, please. Lawrence.
Sure. So for those of you not familiar with it, HB 2646 is a very large, basically cannabis omnibus bill. Representative Eccles is the House author, and the Senate author, Representatives Taylor and Rogers, actually Eccles and Davis from the House. And it passed the House some weeks ago, and it was brought forward in the Senate. What day was that? That was Thursday or Friday?
Yeah, it was Thursday.
On Thursday, and the Senate introduced a significant set of last-minute floor amendments, including three final sections at the end, sections 29, 30, and 31, that pertain to administrative issues for controlled dangerous substances. And my understanding is that those sections came at the request of the OBNDD. So we have Mark Woodward on to basically explain. So why don't we just pass it over to him, and he could explain what sections 29 through 31 are doing in this bill.
Lawrence, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of walk people through what these are about and who they're actually targeting. You know, we've been asked probably for the last 9 to 10 months, what is it that OBN needs more than anything right now to deal with some of the black market that is starting to flourish in parts of our state. And one of the things that we said is that a consistent problem we're having with some of these illegal commercial growers that are coming from other states and setting up shop here and moving marijuana onto the black market is that they're playing kind of a shell game when it comes to ownership. And who these owners are. Obviously there's a residency requirement, and so they're playing kind of a shell game with that of trying to find people who will sign up as the local resident owner. And it's all a lot of documents that really are completely false and misleading by design to hopefully throw off the scent, so that state regulators will not notice some of the shady business practices that are happening. Well, we recognize those right away, but the problem is it wasn't a crime. in Oklahoma, if you lie on your taxes, lie on a marriage license or a fishing license, there are penalties. You could lose your license, and there's nothing that says that there's any penalties for somebody lying on an application with the Bureau of Narcotics or providing false records. And so we asked the legislature to put in an amendment that creates a misdemeanor for those. And again, this is fraudulent. This is not, oops, I didn't sign this portion, or I didn't realize, my business partner was going to, back out on us, or I got the wrong address. I was off by a number. No, this is egregious, intentional lying on an application. For example, putting some local owner of the farm, hiring somebody to put their name on their work, on their work forms and their applications when the real ownership is either out of state or even overseas. So it would create a misdemeanor and give us an opportunity right there to suspend or revoke their license and take some action to put them out of business, or at the very least, discourage them from coming here and trying to get away with that. And so it's a misdemeanor, but that's what it does is we're seeing a lot of intentional fraudulent information put on applications, and we're seeing records that are being submitted that are completely false and misleading about the marijuana. And that leads us into this raid that a lot of people saw on Friday. So that's the First Amendment, creating a misdemeanor for lying on an application or a record. Intentional. This is not an oops. This is not an oops. We had 100 plants and I only put 90. No, we're talking about egregious, intentional fraud that they're committing on an application or a record that they submit to our agency. The Second Amendment allows us to take administrative action on a non-registrant who is involved in a registered activity. And simply put, we've got people who get an OMMA license to grow, but they never get an OBN license. And so if they're growing marijuana without a license from OBN, they're essentially cultivating. And that's a criminal act in Oklahoma that could lead to the seizure of the plants and criminal charges being filed. Yet we realized in most of these cases that was simply an oversight. So we don't want to be left with our only option being seizing plants and filing criminal charges. So this amendment will allow us to take administrative action. This way they could keep their plants, they can continue to water them, take care of them, tend them. They'll probably have to suspend or cease their sales until they get their license in order, which will probably take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks max. And then they're back in business. And that way we're able to do an administrative penalty, such as possibly a fine and suspending their activity until they get their paperwork in order, rather than having to do criminal charges and seize their plants for cultivation. And so that was simply an oversight, that there was no minor penalty for failing to get an OBN license. It basically just said that you're cultivating and it's a criminal act. And that's simply not what we need to be doing on the majority of these people who do not get an OBN license. So that's what those two amendments would do.
Okay, I see my dog's photo bombing. Sorry, guys. She's going to participate in the show whether I want her to or not. So, Mark, was there any other amendments you guys added to that, or was that it? And is this just a matter of you trying to get the caught up with what's going on, getting the law caught up with the cannabis being legal?
That's exactly what it is. As we approach the 3-year anniversary of this, we see new techniques used by people who, and again, we're going to stay in our lane if they're doing everything right, but there's people who move into our lane. And those would be people, criminal organizations that come to our state, try to fly under the radar to grow marijuana criminally. And we've got to pass laws to address some of their techniques for doing that. And one of the techniques is, let's provide false information on an application claiming that John Smith is the owner of this farm, when in actuality you talk to John Smith and he's going, I don't know anything about it. All I know is I get a check in the mail every month for $5,000 to keep my mouth shut. That's an intentional criminal act. And this way it would be a misdemeanor, but also it would give us a way to, now they're creating a criminal violation that can allow us to shut them down and hopefully send a message to others. So we didn't have this early on, but now we do have a lot of criminal organizations flocking to Oklahoma because of the land is cheaper, the licenses are cheaper, and they think they can fly under the radar because there's so many farms out here, and they know that regulators and law enforcement can't be at every place at every moment. And so there's a lot of them who have pulled up their stakes in California to New Mexico to Michigan and New York, and they're coming to Oklahoma, hiring crews and buying land, and they're falsifying that information. And so, yeah, it's a way. These amendments are simply a way for us to keep up with the techniques that are being used by intentional criminals. And again, we're not talking about oopses. We're going to work with people all day. Every day we run into people who do not quite have all the security features or the licensing in place, but it's clear that they're trying to do it right. And this was an oversight. It was not a criminal act. And so we've worked with them for 3 years, and we will continue to do so. That's not who we're targeting here. These are people who are they're a criminal organization. They were long before Oklahoma passed this law, but now they're coming here to do what they've been doing for years in other states.
Okay, Lawrence, have you got any other questions about the legislation before we ask about the big raid?
So I understand. So I guess part of what's happening is that without this language, if you discovered a business that was one way or another not properly licensed, then your only option without this would have been under Title 63 to basically charge them with felony cultivation. So this, is that right?
That's correct. It would be felony cultivation. So you're not only filing criminal charges, but we would have no recourse but to seize all of those plants, because technically they would have been grown illegally. They would have been grown without a license. And you're talking about people investing hundreds of thousands of dollars in their life savings. And that's just not an option that needs to be on the table for somebody who's not intentionally doing anything wrong. And so being able to take administrative action, such as just fining them and possibly suspending their activity until they get their paperwork in order, is a much better option than having to go to the DA's office and file criminal charges and seize and destroy those plants. We don't want to do that for somebody who's not intentionally doing anything wrong.
So this is basically going to help protect some people who kind of in a gray zone, that one way or another there might have been some intent, but it wasn't so atrocious that, maybe they were just trying to find some sort of, I don't know what it was, but find some middle ground, and you could give them a slap on the wrist rather than stick them in jail. But I think part of what you're saying also is that with, if this is organized crime, then what I'm imagining happening is that in other states, the cost for licensing and the cost for land and for growing cannabis could be so much higher than in Oklahoma, that maybe somebody from Missouri or somebody from Oregon, maybe not Oregon, but Missouri, or someone from Delaware or wherever might say, hey, let's just open up shop in Oklahoma. Let's grow everything in Oklahoma, then transport it back to Delaware and Missouri. And so they'll be able to get it back to their state and get it into their system in their state, but their cost to grow it will end up being lower because of what the local costs are here in our state. That's part of what you're seeing.
That is it. They are pulling up their stakes from other places and coming here, and they flat out admit it's because of how cheap it is. The land is incredibly cheap. We hear these stories all the time that Chinese groups are coming here. They're paying 3 times for the land what it's worth, and they're growing marijuana. And a lot of that is because whatever they're paying for the land here in Oklahoma is just a fraction of what they would have paid for that same land if they were growing in California or Oregon or Washington. And so Oklahoma is just absolutely prime real estate for criminal organizations. Now it's and if they want to come here, and we've got hundreds that have come here from other states, and they're legally growing, and they do have somebody local who is a legitimate resident owner. There's nothing wrong with people legally coming here and doing it right. We're talking about those who are already, criminals committing, organized crime, and they've packed up and moved to Oklahoma because they think it's easier to operate their organization because of, how crowded it is here in Oklahoma, and that they just think Oklahoma's too overwhelmed to even be able to pay attention to what they're doing. And so they go out in the remote areas and think they're flying under the radar. And that's simply not the case.
So one more thought before we move on to the next topic is, what actually this is saying to me is that look at how well this bodes for Oklahoma once we have federal legalization, or once we're able to have some sort of interstate legal interstate commerce, because if all these other growers from around the country are coming here because of the cost of production, once it's lawful to be able to transfer cannabis between states, then we're basically realizing now that the benefits of companies from around the country to grow here could be enormous for our local economy.
You've studied it a lot more than I have, and I'll take your word for it, Lawrence, but that sounds about right.
Yeah.
It does.
He's saying it's a good thing, Mark.
Yeah.
If you're doing it right, it's absolutely, there's nothing stopping you, and best of luck to you. Our focus is on those who are trying to ruin it for everybody else because they don't want to play by our rules.
Okay, on that note, let's stick with that theme and move over to all the news you got just last week with the bust that you guys did, or the raid. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, a lot of people may have seen Friday morning. We raided a couple. We served warrants at two different locations in Logan County. One was a marijuana farm, and another house that was associated with that farm about 7 miles north of there. And this was one of many that we're looking at all over the state, where these are criminal organizations who come here and get a license. And so on the surface, they've got their paperwork in order, but that's about the only thing they're doing legal. 100% of the harvested product is going out onto the black market, and they're moving cash all over the United States tied to this organized crime. So we want people to rest assured, if you're doing everything right, OBN is not on a witch hunt to look for a farm that is slightly out of compliance on a small issue. These were people who came here, and we've traced hundreds of thousands of dollars in black market bulk quantity sales to this farm that are going all over the United States. And number two, they're filing reports with us saying they didn't have any plants. We can probably document anywhere from 15,000 to 65,000 plants that have been grown just in the last few months on this property and moved, and yet they're reporting 0 plants. So they're falsifying their records. They're moving everything onto the streets, and these are the ones that we're trying to go after, who think Oklahoma is a safe haven for their criminal activity. And again, they're going to hurt the ones who are doing it right. Some of the biggest people and the biggest category of people complaining about these farms are those who say, look, I've dumped my life savings into this farm, and I'm trying to do everything right, and we're bleeding to death because and this is their words, we can't compete with the black market here in Oklahoma. And new farms are popping up every day by some of these criminal organizations. Now, the majority of them are doing everything right, and again, they're never going to see an issue with the Bureau of Narcotics. But the ones where we've got blatant evidence going back 2 months, this was not a tip the day before. This was 2 months worth of investigative work that led us to a lot of different pieces of evidence, and it's going further. We're by no means done on this investigation. This was just one small fragment tied to a much larger organization operating in Oklahoma, and this organization is tied to several other organizations. So we're just at the tip of the iceberg right now. We got a long way to go.
Yeah.
Well, it looked like a pretty big operation. Let me ask, do you believe that any seed to sale tracking system is going to eliminate that?
Well, I think so, because in some of the cases, a lot of the evidence is a traffic stop. You get a box in the middle of the night on a traffic stop, and the guy's fumbling around trying to come up with a story, and you can tell they're lying. And if they're truly following the law and using seed to sale, they're going to have a manifest. We're going to have a phone number. We're going to be able to say if they're truly hauling this marijuana to a processor in Pryor, Oklahoma. It's one simple phone call, Chris, to call that processor in Pryor and say, hey, are you expecting John Smith with a load of 6,000 pounds this afternoon? Yes, I am. And I've got the paperwork and the invoice for it. And we've got the farm where it came from. They've got the manifest and the information to show, yes, 6,000 pounds left our farm this morning, headed to Pryor to a processor. So it'll be have a good day, sir, and send them on their way as long as they've got their transporter license.
So seed
right
to
now,
sale. So hold on. So I'm sorry. So seed to sale in this case would have allowed you to say stop the vehicles leaving the farm and then finding cannabis. And I mean, I'm just wondering, because I understand with you're saying they were reporting that they had 0 plants. Well, we all know the seed to sale programs can be manipulated. So I'm just curious as to how that would have stopped this.
Not all of it, but portions of our investigation that I can't get into. There are areas where it would have made it real simple for us to see that this was clearly a legitimate sale, and this is clearly a legitimate shipment going from point A to point B. That's what you will have, and it may not be on this particular investigation, but every day there's traffic stops all over this country, and you've got semi trucks or refrigerator trucks with product in it, and usually the traffic stop lasts about 5 minutes. They've got their manifest, they've got their transportation card and license, and they've got phone numbers of where it was going, where it came from. You can clearly see, because they're following the seed to sale tracking, that there is a way to determine pretty quick that this is a legitimate load versus a black market load that's trying to be smuggled across the country. So not necessarily speaking about our raid on Friday, but I just think in general, it would certainly save a lot of legitimate transporters a lot of time on the side of the road if they did get stopped for speeding or whatever the reason is, to be able to explain the legality of that shipment versus some of the criminals who are coming up with different stories, and they have no manifest, no paperwork, and it's tough for us to figure out whose story's right. The driver, the passenger, he doesn't know where it's going. He was just told to drive this, and he'd be contacted later with a phone call and an address. That's shady business right there. Legitimate growers and transporters know exactly where they're going, how much they're hauling, and where it came from. And it should take about 10 seconds for them to be able to explain that and prove it through a seed to sale program.
Let me
go ahead.
interject.
Do you have a question? Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
let me interject here, because I just wrote this Tulsa World op-ed on this issue. And I think with respect to law enforcement, and I think with respect to consumer protection, there absolutely is a reason to have inventory tracking, right? That when something leaves the grow and is on the way to a processor, on the way to a dispensary, that to have inventory tracking of that transfer is completely appropriate. So I don't think there's any objection to that. The seed to sale is more complicated though, because the mandate that as soon as you put a seed in the ground, you have to have an RFID tag, right? There's that, and the costs, right, for that is very different than simply saying once we harvest it, now we have a record and a manifest as to what we're doing with that harvest. Right. So I think what Chris was wondering about is whether or not there's any law enforcement benefit to requiring that every seed in the ground has an RFID tag. And that's just a very different issue, because that's not going to be something that's going to be germane to the traffic stop.
Right. But I think there's still some benefit to it, especially if you're talking about whether legitimate owners don't even realize that half of their products is being taken by, whether it's disgruntled employees inside theft, things along those lines. They've got a quick way to call law enforcement and say, look, I do a check about every morning when I come in. I'm missing 3,000 plants somewhere, and I don't know where it's going. So there's absolutely some benefits to it. I mean, will it stop every organized crime? No. But I think in certain circumstances and certain investigations, it would provide some very valuable information for us.
Interesting. We have a question from Deb Holden about whether or not there's any OBNDD action with regards to tainted products in our state. So, have there been any reports of tainted products that are more than just accidental, more than just for instance, a test, right, that shows that there is some kind of pesticide over a limit? But have you been encountering any kinds of criminal activity regarding tainted products here in Oklahoma?
We are aware of some things that we're looking into. I couldn't get into a lot of details, and I will tell you, it is not rampant through the industry. It is very, very isolated, but we've got some cases that we are working involving some intentional adulteration of some marijuana products, and that's probably about all I can say. But very, very rare.
Thank you.
Very, very rare.
All right. Well, Lawrence, do you have any other questions for Mr. Woodward while we still have him?
Yeah, last thing that Mark, you and I have discussed this on a number of occasions, and I just always want to bring it up because it's such a serious issue to me, and it's a big factor in why I've got involved in all of this, which is that we're in this absurd situation where anybody could get a patient card. Anybody over the age of 18 could see a doctor for 2 minutes and get a patient card and purchase cannabis. But if you are in pain management or in, a patient in psychiatry or oncology, the doctor prescribing scheduled medications overwhelmingly will not let you use cannabis. That about 80–85% of doctors out there will not let a patient use cannabis if they're prescribed scheduled medications. So the recommendation could come from another doctor. But if you are a patient seeing Dr. X in pain management and they're prescribing an opioid to you or whatnot, the doctor will terminate you if you use cannabis. And it's 3 years now, and pain management patients can't use cannabis. And I know that the OBN is not in the way of this. I know that the OBN is not responsible for the doctors prohibiting the use of cannabis by their patients. But I don't know if you have anything to say or if you have any ideas as to what the patients out there and this community could do in trying to overcome this barrier that still exists.
Yeah, and like you, I've researched it and I've looked online and talked to different physicians. I've talked to and seen a lot of the research, and there's two different schools on it. I think it seems like if you got 10 doctors in a room, 5 are going to say it's okay to prescribe opioids to a cannabis patient, and 5 are going to say don't. And so I think the answer is, it's just going to take more time. And I don't know if you're ever going to get to a point where you're going to get 100% of the physicians leaning one way or the other. They will all have their particular view based on what they've seen from their particular patients and the research that they are comfortable, leaning towards. OBN does stay out of it. We don't have jurisdiction to go after any physician for the way they prescribe, simply what they're prescribing. Now, we can go after somebody for how much they're prescribing or if they're in reckless disregard for health, but you're talking about prescription medication outside of marijuana. So yeah, we don't go after any doctors when it comes to recommendations for marijuana or have any jurisdiction to do so. Our lane is very, very narrow on that.
Well, if anybody knows of any doctors, let me finish this. If anybody knows of any doctors that give you that excuse that they're being threatened by the OBN, please contact us or contact Mark directly.
Yes.
And let's get to the bottom of that. So sorry,
Right.
Lawrence, go ahead.
It was just going to follow up. It's very similar to a couple of years ago. There were some new opioid guidelines, and Chris, you and I have talked about this. With acute and chronic pain, and the recommendations were to get patients under 100 MME, and the doctors were misinterpreting it and saying that I have to get patients under 100 MME or I could go to jail, and OBN's going to put me in jail. And we had patients calling us saying that they were just in tears, and we said that is not only is that false. We don't have the jurisdiction to tell a doctor they have to get a patient under 100 MME. The recommendation is if you go over 100 MME with a patient, you have to enter into a paying contract if it's more than 3 months and have a consultation with the patient of why you're keeping them on those high levels, and then document it in their charts of why you believe higher MME is necessary. Those are the only steps that a doctor needs to take. But it was unfortunate that a lot of doctors either were misinterpreting it or were using that law as an excuse to fire patients. And they were saying, no, it's because OBN's going to put me in jail. And not only is that false, but we legally wouldn't have the jurisdiction to put somebody in jail simply for having a patient over 100 MME. So thank you, Chris, for pointing that out, that regardless of what your doctor's doing, it's not because of anything that OBN has recommended or suggested when it comes to cannabis.
Yeah, I definitely like the names of the doctors. We definitely need to stop the bad rumors. Lawrence, have you got anything else for Mr. Woodward while we have him?
Just one last thing. If there's a way in which we can get a representative from the DEA to appear on this show or to be able to speak to this pain management issue, that would be great. Because if the pressure is not coming from the OBN, and I understand that it's not coming from the OBN, is it just the doctors just spinning their own story? They sit around, a dinner table and they come up with these ideas, or whether or not there is some kind of subtle, pressure or insinuations coming on the part of the DEA representatives here in our state that is shaping the doctors' perspectives. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Right. I can't speak for DEA, but they would be in the same boat we are. And that is that while they could make verbal recommendations, they typically don't. It's the doctors themselves making a choice based on the research that they've read. And so you may have a lot of doctors who go to conferences all over the country that talk about how marijuana is okay to recommend with somebody being prescribed opioids. And then other pain management doctors are going to conferences around the country where negative outcomes have been experienced, and the recommendation is not to prescribe cannabis to somebody who's also getting some type of opioid. And so you just have two different camps in the medical profession, has been my experience, based on the conferences they've attended, other colleagues that they've spoken to, and other research that they've read has led them to their either for or against cannabis. It's not OBN or DEA, because like I said, we don't have jurisdiction or a lane there.
Great.
Okay,
All right.
so
Well, thank you so much for your talk.
let me see
Chris?
if I can sum up this, because I'm seeing some questions on here. Last year you were talking about needing more teeth in current law. I guess we can assume your amendments, which allow you to do the new administrative things, are the new teeth that you got this year, right?
That and being able to create a separate crime for intentionally providing false or misleading information on an application or a record that's submitted. And again, I can't stress enough, that's intentional criminal fraud. That's not an oops, but that will be very helpful, because we will still have other mechanisms to go after criminals in Oklahoma, but that's another avenue that we can pursue. So we could take immediate action now, and then possibly, months down the road, when we conclude our investigation, we may still file criminal charges, felonies, as is the case with this farm on Friday. But a misdemeanor lying or false information would allow us to take immediate action much quicker, and then we'll deal with the felony convictions later and some of those charges. So yeah, that's part of the teeth that we needed. Absolutely. That'd be very helpful.
Okay. And last, the raid you did the other day, you would say those are not people to belong in the Oklahoma medical marijuana program. That would be, I think you used the word cartel or organized crime. Is that who's? Could you possibly tell us what state they were from, where the weed was going, or anything else about that? We've got some questions on here about who it was.
Well, I mean, it's like, yeah, it's organized crime. You can call it a cartel. You can call it a criminal crime ring, a network. But they're moving black market marijuana all over the U.S. and moving the money and the proceeds all over the U.S. and possibly outside the U.S. And so it doesn't really matter. It's not a particular state. If I said it's all going to South Carolina, that really wouldn't mean anything. It's like the drug cartels out of Mexico. They don't just bring drugs to Oklahoma. That they'll supply the drugs in all 50 states and make money. They're businessmen, and they're criminal businessmen, and that's what this particular organization is as well.
Okay, well, I think that's about it, Mark. I want to thank you for coming on here and for being so responsive. I just messaged you about this 24 hours ago, maybe. I mean, it was just recently. So, and you're right here willing to help out and make sure everybody understands it. So I want to thank you for coming on. Everybody, please stay with us. We're going to let Mark go, and Dr. Pasternack and I are going to continue. Mark, you're going to have to check yourself out. Thank you.
We'll do it. You take care. Take care, Lawrence.
You too.
Okay, Lawrence, we have a few other things to discuss, mainly 2646 and some of what it does. Can we take a look at that?
Sure. I think on the agenda still, and some people are probably more curious about one, or some people are more curious about the other, but one of the issues is 2646, and then the other issue is conversation related to petition, citizen initiative with regards to a possible constitutional amendment. So we'll start out with the 2646, and let me call up a list. Just give me a moment here. I wrote up a list of all the things that 2646 does.
Now, this is the
So
bill
maybe-
this is the bill we were just talking about with Mr. Woodward. Only this time we're not going to go over necessarily what his requests are. I think we understand those a little bit better now, so we can move on past those. But there's plenty of other stuff in this bill that needs a real hard look. And so let's do that. Go ahead, Lawrence.
All right, so I'm going to set up a screen share here. And this is just really quick point form stuff. I'm not getting into the details. There's lots of subtleties and nuances. So people who are concerned about one topic or another, you'll have to look at the exact wording. And
Remind us how many pages that is, Lawrence. That's a big bill.
125. Yeah,
Okay.
125 pages.
Oh,
And
hey, before you tear into that, I hate to interrupt you. This is somewhat important, and I forgot to even mention this before we started the show when we were writing down some notes. But I was watching Representative Eccles on the news this morning, every Sunday morning. Him and former Democratic representative do kind of a point counterpoint show. I don't remember the name right now. Anyway, and Representative Eccles made it clear that against his will, but the way it's going to be is there's going to be one omnibus bill for cannabis each year. At least that seems to be all they're willing to do at this point. And he emphasized that this morning, and he also emphasized how that isn't going to. He didn't think that would be the way to address everything. We don't think so either. I think that's how they're going to sneak a lot of this in on us. This is an omnibus bill here, and as we're going to see, it covers a lot of issues. And so therefore, next year and every year after that, when they put one of these out, you're going to have to really pay attention to every single word. So go ahead, Lawrence.
Okay. Just as a couple preliminary points. One is that some of you are familiar with this, some of you aren't. There's been some confusion online that for the most part, whenever you're looking at a bill, a large amount of the bill will be amendatory. Sometimes there's new law, sometimes the bill will contain new law and amendatory, but it's very common that there'll be a relevant amount of amendatory sections in a bill. And what those amendatory sections do is they take existing law and then they either remove something and or add something to existing law. They amend existing law. So when you look at those 125 pages, it's probably the case that 110 of those 125 pages is existing law, right? It's the language already in law. And it's just that section by section, they're tweaking the law, all right? So when you read the words on there, it's not new law. Almost all of it is not new legal language. Almost all of it is existing language. And then when something is underlined, that's new law. When something is struck out, that's removing existing law. But when it's just plain ordinary text, that's nothing new happening. That's just the existing law that you're then adding in the underlined bit. So just for clarification for people who are still getting a handle on how to read law, that's the way to approach all this text. What I'm now going to do, one more sort of preliminary thing, is up here at the top, I have some other specifics that popped into 2646 at the last minute as Senate floor amendments. The rest of it is the language that was part of 2646 when it was brought to the floor. So I'll deal with the floor amendments at the end. All right. So now, okay, I'm just going to go over this all quickly because you can see there's a big long list of them. So I'm just going to kind of run through it. And Chris, you stop me if there's something you want me to elaborate on. If somebody wants me to elaborate something who's watching in the audience, just bring it up, and Chris could hopefully keep his eye on that. So to begin, it sets a price of $20 for a reprint for a patient card. So if you lost your patient card, or if your patient card was stolen and you have to request a new one from the OMMA, then it's going to cost you $20. It removes the limits on what data the health department may keep from patient licenses. So formerly it said the OMMA may only retain X, Y, and Z pieces of information from your applications. It removes that language. So basically whatever you put on your application form, they could retain that information. Rather than the OMMA having only 2 weeks to review a business license, they will through this now have up to 90 days to review a business license. There's just a move of penalties to businesses for sales. It's just they moved it to a different location. Likewise, if there's discrepancies with regards to the records that you have, that's been moved as well to a different location in law. It allows, and probably a lot of you know this, it will allow pre-rolls from growers and dispensaries. And I think a question people have has to do with what sort of testing will be required for those pre-rolls, and the law just is not clear on that. Testing is required, but whether or not it'll have to be retested, that's not clear, and that's probably going to have to be answered then in the rulemaking process. So if you don't think that the pre-roll should be retested, that's something probably that'll have to be taken up with the OMMA. They separate processor licenses into 2 categories. One version, the previous version, refers to it as volatile versus non-volatile. The floor amended version says hazardous versus non-hazardous. So if you're a processor and you use certain types of processing that aren't volatile or hazardous, then you may only need to get the light processing license. And what's the benefit of that? One benefit to that is that it allows cities and counties to work on zoning differences. So if you're only engaged in light processing, they might allow you to be, for instance, in a commercial, as opposed to requiring that you're in an industrially zoned area. That's one of the main points for that. It clarifies, there's ongoing question as to exactly what the 1,000-foot rule is between dispensaries and schools. Is it door to door? Is it property line to property line? And it clarifies that. I don't know exactly why they did this. They delete the definition of good cause, probably because they no longer need that definition with regards to something. It clarifies that inventory tracking has to be for the entire lifespan of the plant, setting the stage obviously for something like metric. It cleans up the definition of a strain, and people are pretty happy.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Hold on a second. Go back to that one you just said. It for the entire life of the plant. Excuse me. So you'll have to buy a tag the minute you clone it. What, the minute it takes root, the minute a seed pops out of the ground, it has to have a tag. Because other states do it differently. Some states do it where it's 6 inches. Some do it where it's higher. So I'm just curious. You're saying the life of the plant. That sounds like from the minute it pops out, you got to have a tag.
So first of all, the statute itself doesn't make reference to any tags. So let's say, for instance, we had a seed to sale tracking system where you simply just have to report in your logs, I planted a seed.
And then say tags could be required at a later stage.
That's right. So even though it says that there has to be inventory tracking for the entire lifespan of the plant, that doesn't mandate RFID tags. That just basically says that you have to have a record. You have to maintain some kind of tracking. It doesn't stipulate what kind of tracking it is. So if you plant a seed, you have to say, I planted a seed. It doesn't require, that language itself doesn't require an RFID tag.
Okay,
but,
good.
Right, the vibe is that it's meant to set the stage, right? So an issue here is that people wonder why Ron Durbin delayed as he did to filing the lawsuit. And a reason why is because the earlier he files a lawsuit, the more opportunity the legislature has to change the laws to nullify his lawsuit, right? So there's this kind of balancing act that he had to work out, because on the one hand, there's a pressure to the industry to comply with metric. But on the other hand, there's the opportunity for the lawmakers to put into law whatever metric needs. And so here's one of those instances where you're kind of at this cusp, right? That now basically the Senate is going to change the law so that you have to have tracking from the entire lifespan of the plant.
Okay.
Right?
Go ahead.
Move on. Cleans up the definition of a strain. I won't go into it, but nevertheless, there's an improvement there that people like. It deletes the test batch definition, but that's really complicated because the language that's used in the version of the bill that went to the floor is different than the language that's used in the floor amended version with regards to test batches. So I'll kind of hold off on that. Now, it authorizes the OMA to, one farther back, requires businesses to submit samples for quality assurance labs. So if the OMA says we want a sample of your product for the quality assurance, it basically sets up the situation where they're authorized to request it and for you to supply it. It authorizes the OMA to suspend or revoke a business if it has unpaid fines. Now, page 51, 52, maybe I'll open that up. So just give me 1 second here, because this was something that, as I was reading it, worried me greatly. So I want to go over it. And I texted with Representative Eccles about this last night, and Ron Durbin and Fetgetter getting their input because it bothered me. So here is something that concerned me as I was reading it. Where is it? Here it is. In the previous version, it's page 51, 52. Now it's page 52, 53. But it says here, in addition to any other remedies provided for by law, the department, pursuant to its rules and regulations, may issue a written order to any license the department has reason to believe has violated sections 420 through 426, basically any marijuana law whatsoever, the Oklahoma Patient Protection Act, Waste Management Act, or any rule promulgated by the State Commissioner of Health, which presumably eventually will become able as well, and to whom the department has served not less than 30 days previously a written notice of violation of such statutes or rules. So just simplify this. In addition to any other remedies provided by law, the department can issue a written notice of violation. Now, this is what worried me about that. In Senate Bill 445, there was an attempt to re-felonize various cannabis-related activities. So Senate Bill 445 said, in addition to, in addition to any other penalties provided by law. So Senate Bill 445 basically said, in addition to any other penalties provided for by law, and then it used the language for what would happen if a patient shared cannabis, or what would happen if a dispensary were to sell cannabis to somebody without a patient card. And what 445 would have done was it would have gone back to the Uniform Controlled Dangerous Substances Act. And basically, if you were a patient who transferred cannabis to somebody, you shared a joint with somebody, then it would be a felony with a mandatory minimum of 2 years in jail. That's what 445 was going to do before hopefully we stopped it. And then likewise, if you're a dispensary and you sold to somebody who didn't have a patient card, let's say a brother takes the other brother's ID or whatever, then likewise, it would have been a felony with a 2-year prison sentence. That's what Senate Bill 445 was going to do. Hopefully we stopped it. But when I saw this language here in this bill, my worry was the Senate was trying to sneak it back in. And So I just wanted to raise people's awareness about this. Doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen. And Durbin was worried as well about it, and Fetgetter was worried as well about it. And when I communicated with Eccles, he said, no, that's not what this is going to do. And I asked that they make a little bit of a change here so that it's not any license holder, whatever. See where it says order to any licensee, that they just clarify that it's a business licensee, because otherwise there's nothing in this section that distinguishes between patient and business. And so my worry is that by that language, any other remedies provided by law, a remedy could include a punishment, that it slips back in the criminal charges related to the Uniform Controlled Dangerous Substances Act. That's a worry that I have, and I just want people to be aware. And according to Representative Eccles, that's not something we're going to have to be concerned with, but I would, for safety's sake, because who knows what DA might try to exploit this and how, that they add in the word business before licensing. Shall I move on? I know it's complicated.
Oh,
All
I'm
right,
sorry. I
so-
had my mic muted. I was talking and had my mic muted. Yes, let's move on, please.
Okay, so let me go back to, hang on. One second here. Screen share, go back to this, share. All right. It's pretty blanket, broad language, but it gives the OMA emergency powers to take action needed to address emergencies, including a fine of up to $10,000 per day for non-compliance of an order. So if the OMA says, oh my God, you can't be doing this, Mr. Dispenser, you're a processor or a grower, you have to stop immediately. If you don't stop, then they could fine you up to $10,000 a day. It gives the patient the power to terminate their caregiver. So basically, if you say to your caregiver, I don't want you to be my caregiver anymore, it gives the patient power to immediately terminate their caregiver. That, I think, sounds reasonable, because if you're the patient, they're the caregiver, you should have the power to terminate them immediately without an appeal on the part of the caregiver. You know, you're the patient, it's about your needs. Next thing is that if you've committed any violation, basically, of the marijuana related statutes, if you've committed any fraudulent sales or fraudulent reporting and so on and so forth, then you'll be denied for 5 years if you seek a new business business license. That should be fees. That they introduce some fees if you are renewing late. And if you have an expired license, then the business, if you're a business with an expired license, then you can't sell or transfer your marijuana. It sets up the rules for the compliance labs. It revises, and like I said, the revise gets revised again, but in this version of it, it revises test batches to 25 pounds for grower, for processors 4 liters, but not more than 1 test for every 200 grams of THC, but that gets changed again. Sets up some more lab rules, sets up some more language for remediation for the transfer of flower. And it points out that monthly reporting for your business, inventory tracking for your business is private information. It's not subject to the Open Records Act. It can be, however, given to other agencies like the OBN, but it's not something that could be publicly accessible through an Open Records Act. So that's just a lot of information, I know, but all that stuff is from the version of the bill when it got to the Senate floor. Now, lastly, up here is the further amendments that took place on the Senate floor. I'll go to the first one. I'll get to last, because I think that's the one that's going to bother us the most. That the OMA can require information from businesses that will assist in any investigations that have to do with diversion. that the health commissioner, then presumably the able commissioner eventually, will be able to adopt rules and fines for a business that fails to permit an inspection. If they say they won't let anybody come in to inspect their store or their grow, then they could be fined. Now, again, like I said, it changes the harvest language. I should say the batch language changes and changes. And so in the Senate floor amendment, it brings the harvest batches back down to 10 pounds, unless it's being sold to a processor, because then the harvest batch could be 50 pounds. And then finally, just as we had Mark Woodward on a moment ago, there's 12 pages of further language at the end, mostly mandatory, pertaining to some of the other OBN needs to deal with issues having to do with criminal enterprises. So going back now to this one, dispensaries, if this becomes law, dispensaries will no longer be allowed to sell cannabis, quote unquote, deli style. You know, most dispensaries have these jars and they go into the jar and they pull out some flour and then they weigh it. That will become illegal based upon this. Everything is going to have to be prepackaged. So you're not going to be able to smell it. It will be unlawful to allow people to handle it, to touch it, to smell it. You're allowed to look at it. You're allowed to look at it. They still allow you to look at it. But that's it.
So that would be through the window of a prepackaged package. Maybe.
For now. Maybe
now.
next year you won't be allowed to look at it either.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you can have a window. I don't know. I haven't checked labeling lately.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, but
So,
you can't smell
you
it.
know,
It specifically says you won't be.
Can't smell
It
it.
can't be available to smell. Now, not touching it. You know, you're never been able to touch it, and that's fine. But not being able to smell it, you know, a lot of people won't purchase it if they can't smell it first.
So
I mean, I'm seeing where we go up and we take a card that says wedding cake or Blue Dream or whatever kind you're picking out, and you take it to a window, a bulletproof glass, and they hand you a sealed bag of something you can't see in, and you're told you must go home and you must only consume this with all your lights off in your house when no one else is there. You know, I'm seeing what's next. Where is this going? We can't smell it when we buy it. What next year? No public consumption, which kills all these events everybody's doing. Go ahead, Lawrence.
I could go to the grocery store and I could go to the apples and the oranges and the bananas and the limes and the lemons and the grapefruit and the celery and the carrots and the leeks. You know, I could go to all those fruits and vegetables and I could touch them and I could smell them, right? I could squeeze them. I could roll them around in my hands. I could cough on them.
I'm wanting less and
And I
less
put
of.
them
I'm
back.
wanting less and less store fruit as you go on. I'm getting scared to go to the store and get fruit as you go on, Lawrence.
We
I understand.
can squeeze and touch and smell. You know, people will drop the apples on the floor and they'll pick them up and put them back on the bin. And, you know, all the fruits and vegetables in the supermarket, we can handle. And we can't even smell the cannabis. Like, this is psychotic. This is psychotic. This is the idea that this little bud is so dangerous that it's going to basically spread disease. It's going to come out and leap out of that jar and attack you by the throat. Rip your throat out.
I'm not so sure psychotic is what it is, but I can tell you that the mood at the Capitol is considerably different than it's ever been. And nobody has the tolerance for anything cannabis related at the Capitol. One of the amendments that I watched, and I posted about it as it happened, to this bill, an amendment that was passed, but then was pulled when my senator, while messaging me about it, kept bringing up question after question after question until they counted enough votes to stop the whole bill. Then the guy decided to pull the amendment. But this amendment would have allowed any North American publicly traded company to come in and buy up the industry, and there was no limits on what percentage of a business they could buy. And the telling part wasn't even that somebody was pushing that, and that wasn't really surprising, but it was his response when my senator asked him the question, well, does this mean that a Canadian company can come down here and take over? His response was, well, we need people in this industry that know what they're doing. That was his response. And that amendment passed. A few voted against it. It was only when the entire bill got threatened that amendment got pulled. And then they agreed to put the title back on the bill and move this bill forward. So this bill has passed the Senate. This is just going to the governor. Or, well, I think it has to go back to committee since it's changed again. It's got to go back to the House. So it's not going to the governor yet, but we're getting there. And what I'm saying is that the thinking at the Capitol, I watched Representative West argue for that bill, that caps bill. And I watched him and several others say in the House side over and over say, well, I'm getting calls every day of people complaining about weed everywhere, and they're just sick of it. And so I mean it when I say that the mood has really changed at the Capitol. Now, we can say, well, we're the 57%, we can vote them out, but we have to be politically realists here. And the chances of voting enough people out all at one time is slim, especially in some of these small towns or small districts where they don't think like they do in the city. I mean, it was Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and Lawton, I think, was the majority of where the 788 votes came from. Well, that really hasn't changed, and now everybody's tired of seeing it. So this bill, this don't smell your cannabis, I see next year being no public consumption and several other issues I'm concerned about. What do you think? What do you think, Lawrence?
The 57%. So polling for legalization of medical marijuana about a year before the 788 vote was about 72%. So about 72% of Oklahomans, excuse me, in 2017 supported legalization of medical marijuana. Only 57% voted for 788. That is, we lost 15% of the public support for medical marijuana because of the 788 is not medical PAC that opposed 788. So basically argued that 788 wasn't a genuine medical program. And so while 72% of the population supported the medical program, only 57% supported 788. Now, of that 57%, some of them might say, well, it's medical enough for me. Now I don't know what they'll think. But the issue is, consider this. How many people for whom is cannabis their number one political issue? How many of them is it their litmus test issue? How many of them is it their number one priority that they decide on who they're going to vote for based upon where they stand on cannabis? That's not 57%.
No,
that's
I
maybe
think
5%, 10%.
Yeah, I think the overwhelming majority. Well, I mean, we sent more people, more of the same party to the Capitol this last time that are currently voting against what we would want in cannabis. So, you know, we vote against our own best interest for the sake of that big R or D.
Let me point this out, that 57% of the state voted for 788, but 57% of the state do not have cannabis cards.
Yeah, and it wasn't 57% that voted for cannabis, though. It was 57% of the people that voted that day on that particular issue. That's all. It was 57% adding the no's and the yeses, not adding all the people that didn't vote on it.
Sure, right. So 57% of the people who voted on that state question. And so the voter turnout was in the ballpark of 1 million people, right? So about, what was it? About 500 and something thousand people voted for 788. And so what do we have? We have about, you're making a good point, we have about 400,000 cardholders, right? So, you know, that actually means that it's pretty close. Just number wise, about the same number of people who voted for 788 are people who have cards.
Hmm.
But then all the other people in the state who don't have cards, it's just like, what is their political stance? If the lawmakers were to tighten up this program, if the lawmakers were to introduce qualifying conditions, would they care?
Well,
they
I'll
oppose
point
it?
out, I want to say what Damon Beck's been pointing out on here. And I know this to be true too. I see it all the time. For every card holder, there's probably 4 people in the state using cannabis that don't have the card. So,
Yeah, people are afraid of getting on the list. People don't want to
Right.
spend the money. People don't use it often enough, right? So there's lots of reasons why people don't get a card.
right.
I
You
think
see a lot
4
of it.
people per card might be a little bit high, but you know, maybe it's about a person and a half.
Well,
average it
I,
over
I would, it may be less than 4, but I say it's more than 1.5. How about that? We'll go 3. I'll give you 3. I'll give you 3. That's all I'm going 3. Lawrence, we've already gone over an hour. I know what we planned on talking about, but I suggest that maybe we just throw out a teaser on it and move it to either tomorrow night or next Sunday. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, so I'd like to just talk about that other issue a little bit. Let me just get a link right now to put
Okay,
up on.
All right.
So give me 1 second here.
Now, what we're talking about here is with what we've been discussing, it should be coming pretty clear to everybody that, as I was stated at the Capitol during that last rally, if we keep looking at, well, we start here. As we just said, 500 and something thousand of us voted for 788. It was the people that voted for it. It was the people that wrote it. The people at the Capitol have not improved the program since the beginning. It's getting tighter and tighter. It's going to look like California in 12 to 18 months, in my opinion. So we have to stop looking to them for the solutions. And so that's what we want to talk about is possible solutions, because obviously an omnibus bill once a year is not a solution. So go ahead, Lawrence.
Yeah, the way I see it is that we got just about as good as we could imagine, as we possibly could have hoped for with 788, right? We got 57% of the vote. If it was more open, we might have gotten less of the vote. So we got just about as good as we could have hoped for in 788. And now the lawmakers are going to try to whittle it away and whittle it away and whittle it away and whittle it away. So I think that people are starting to catch on to this trend. We're seeing that the lawmakers are just opposed to cannabis and are seeking to restrict the program. So there's been discussion about the possibility of a new citizen initiative, because it's we the people who want our liberty. It doesn't seem like they care about our liberty. We care about our liberty. And so Chris and I have been in conversation with about 4 or 5 different groups of activists out there who have an intent to produce an initiative. So different groups, different ideas. They're at various stages of writing progress, but there's all these efforts out there, just conversations, language being drafted. There's lots of people who are thinking the only way in which we're going to be able to get what we want is by another initiative. So I just sat down one day, and based upon what people have been telling me, what I see is the best in 788, what we really want to achieve with regards to personal liberty, with regards to ensuring that everybody has access, with regards to criminal justice reform, getting people out of jail, expunging records, I wrote down basically a body of ideas. And so I'm putting on the link here to the website. It's a PDF file. And in no way whatsoever is this like a finished project. In no way whatsoever is this something that in its form is intended to be filed as an initiative. It is just basically a conversation starter. These are the kind of the bundle of issues that I think are at the heart of what the next step could look like. So I really encourage people to look at it. And the email address on that page you could find is lrp@okcla.org. So read it, read the petition, and email me with feedback. Lots of ways in which we could change it, but basically the crux of what I'm doing is possession limits. Ideally, we wouldn't need any possession limits, but one way or another, if we don't do it, the legislature is going to introduce possession limits. So I set up the possession limits basically as we have it in have them in 788, with a few little tweaks and improvements, like whatever your harvest is from your plants, you're allowed to keep it, right? You're not restricted to only keeping 8 ounces from your plants. You can keep whatever you've harvested from your own plants, including suppositories and ointments and things like that that just weren't mentioned in 788. So that's sort of the essence of possession. And then a large section of all of our rights as patients, going from issues of housing to school to medical care, with regards to safety sensitive jobs. My thought is the safety sensitive employer, the only restriction that should really matter is you can't be under the influence at work. So set a restriction that says you can't use cannabis immediately prior to starting your workday, within 8 hours of your workday, something along those lines.
That would be
But
for
somebody
safety
wants to-
sensitive.
That would be specifically right. So the language is the only restriction, the only employment related restriction that the Constitution would allow is one that pertains specifically to safety sensitive jobs, and that somebody cannot be under the influence of cannabis at work. There's other ways of doing it, right? That in theory, so long as their cognition is not negatively impacted, then it doesn't matter when they do it. But this is just one way.
I want to point out this isn't a new idea. This is being done. So we're not reinventing the wheel here with that idea. The sky doesn't fall.
A lot of other states do it.
Yeah, go ahead, Lawrence.
Right. This is a way in which it's done in Canada. This is a way in which it's done in other states, that you're going to let anybody use cannabis regardless of their employment. It's just that if an employer wants to set a rule, the only rule they could set is you can't be while you're at work. And that's specifically for safety sensitive. So those are the kinds of patient related issues. There's a lot more of them, but a lot of protections for patients. And then simply authorizing the existence of a regulatory. I set the cost for business licenses at, I changed it from 10% to 5% of the median household income. And so rather than saying $2,500, I set it at 5% of the median household income, which brings it to $2,500. But I benchmark it to an economic index, because if this works and we have it in the Constitution and there's inflation, we want still to be able to adjust relative to inflation as the years move forward. So 5% of the median household income for a business, no caps on businesses. And then expungement.
Go ahead, but let's wrap it up pretty quick.
And then expungement, and who pays for expungement? The monies that come in as revenue from the program pay for expungement. So if you need your cannabis charges expunged, rather than you having to fork out the $1,000 or $2,000, there'll be a program that will pay for it for you.
Okay, so as he said, he's put the link in there. I've been posting the link for a while now. We've had a lot of great people giving some great ideas. It sounds like Lawrence has already put some of those in there. So, as he has stated, this is just a bare bones. How do we get started? How do we start these conversations? And they're starting, so it's working. That's the idea. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. What?
This is just a way to put the issues on the table so we could have conversations.
Okay. Well, we've gone about an hour and 15 minutes now, so we're going to wrap it up. Why don't you guys read that petition? We will do a little more work on it, add in some of those suggestions, and put together a little bit better show to talk about about that in further detail, maybe a week from now, instead of doing it tomorrow. Give everybody time to get a look at it and give some input. Maybe we can make some changes before then. All right. Well, that's it, Lawrence. I appreciate you being here. It's been fun. And Mark, if you're still watching, thank you for coming on. I appreciate all that information. Thank you, everybody, for watching and sharing. I appreciate that. We will come back and do this again very soon. Until next time, stay grumpy. I'll see you on the road.
Bye.